Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Tom Wright, President and CEO of Regional Plan Association. I want to thank you for joining members of our coalition, the Build Gateway Now group, for this special webinar to provide an update on where things stand with the Gateway project, with a particular focus this afternoon on the legal strategy and the issues around that. I'm joined by my friends and colleagues, Subash Iyer from Kaplan Kirsch and RPA's Executive Vice President, Kate Slevin. So what we're going to do this afternoon is just give a little bit of some context setting of where we are, and then I've asked Subash to give us a kind of overview of what's happening legally right now with Gateway and the various lawsuits from the states and the Gateway Development Commission. Then Kate is going to talk a little bit about the advocacy efforts connected to this. And then we will have time at the end for Q&A from folks. If you have questions for either of them, you can use the chat function to put them in, and we have staff who will be looking at those, and we hope to get to those at the end. I'm also going to say we're not going to spend too much time or any time really today talking about what Gateway is, why it's important. We've been advocating for this, some of us, for over 25 years now. You can go to the RPA website. I think in the chat we'll be putting some of them up, links to the reports that RPA and our partners have done, just talking about what the project is and the importance of it. But I'm assuming that really folks understand and know that. Why we're here today is because on October 5th of last year, federal funding for the Gateway project and also the Second Avenue subway phase 2 that the MTA was building were both paused by the federal government, and the funding stopped coming. For a couple of months, that part of this was during the government shutdown, and there were questions, and Subash and others can explain in more detail about amending some of the contracting procedures to comply with current federal policy. But after all of that work had been done, the funds were not released. And so the Gateway Development Corporation sued on February 2nd in the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. And the next day, New York and New Jersey states both followed suit in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. On Friday, February 6th, the Gateway Development Commission announced that they were stopping work on 4 of the 5 different major contracts that were underway at the time. And so the projects had to wind down. On that day, Friday, February 6th, excuse me, Judge Vargas of the Southern District of New York ordered the federal government to unlock the billions in federal grants to the program as the case proceeded through the courts. The following week, the federal funds started to be dispersed, initially with $30 million, and eventually we think about $236 million was released by the feds, which has allowed the Gateway Development Commission to restart the 4 projects that had been suspended during that period of time. However, the lawsuits, I think, are still pending. And the GDC has held off on 2 new major procurements that it had planned to do, pending kind of clarity over whether they will have full access to the federal funds. So these issues have not gone away, and we thought that it would be appropriate at this time to give a briefing, a more in-depth briefing of the legal issues that remain out there. So I'm very pleased to have an extraordinary expert to talk about this. Subash Iyer is the former acting general counsel of the U.S. Department of Transportation, where he served as Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg's top legal advisor, overseeing a 500-person legal team, leading the department's rulemaking agenda, streamlining processes to expedite project delivery, and defending landmark transportation and environmental policies. He also served as chief counsel to the Federal Transit Administration, the FTA, and has worked for the MTA in New York City. Subash is currently a partner with Kaplan Kirsch, and I'm pleased to say he is a member of RPA's board of directors. Subash, could I turn it over to you to give an explanation of where we stand right now?
Yes, thank you, Tom, for having me, and it's good to see everyone on today's webinar. I think to understand the lawsuit and where we are in the overall process, it is worth taking one step back and talking a little bit about how with such a complex project, and in here we're talking about in particular the Hudson Tunnels Project, a $16 billion project, it actually takes a lot of different sources of funding. And in particular, with respect to the federal government, there are 4 separate U.S. Department of Transportation grant programs or loan programs that are involved in supporting this $16 billion project. And the reason why I say that is because I'm going to take one of them and just sort of talk through a little bit of where we stand with respect to that one grant. It is the largest grant that supports the Hudson Tunnels Project. It's a federal transit administration capital investment grant. And that program called CIG for short. It's $6.88 billion. So a little bit less than half of the total project cost is being supported by this one FTA grant, about a $7 billion grant that was signed in 2024. And the reason why I'm starting there is because it's important to understand how that program works in order to understand where we are and really sort of highlighting that this lawsuit that we're talking about deals with one small portion of the overall funding that is ultimately going to need to be provided to see this project through. And so in 2024, there was a grant agreement that was signed. That is a commitment from the federal government, a contract, a multi-year commitment to provide funding as Congress makes that funding available over the course of 10 years. And so every year, Congress provides additional funding, roughly $700 million. And the agreement requires the federal government to then pay that money out to the Gateway Development Commission as long as the project remains in compliance with its federal requirements. But now we sort of get to the key issue, which is how does Gateway actually get that money into its bank account? And the answer is unique for sort of federal government contracting, especially with grant making with respect to the Department of Transportation, and that is reimbursement. So Gateway has to actually go and incur costs, and then it seeks reimbursement from the federal government. So while we have a $16 billion program and a $7 billion grant, only a small portion of that funding is actually ready to go into the pockets of, or into the bank accounts of the Gateway Development Commission. And that's where we sort of pick up with the lawsuit that was filed. The process of reimbursement was working smoothly with respect to all of these different grant programs until September of last year in 2025. And at that point, the U.S. Department of Transportation said they were going to pause reimbursement of this program pending a review of certain practices related to disadvantaged business enterprises, which are a special sort of regulatory program that the U.S. Department of Transportation has that conditions federal funding on having a DBE program. They said they were going to conduct this administrative review, and they said that at the end of that review, they would make a determination as to whether to resume reimbursements in the program. That process dragged on for a while, and if you look at some of the court filings, you can see some of the back and forth that took place between Gateway Development Commission and the federal government, and that process ended up not being fruitful, and that was what prompted the lawsuits that Tom talked about. So now we sort of get to the lawsuits themselves, and there are 2 separate lawsuits here that we're talking about. Lawsuit 1 is filed by GDC itself, and that's a breach of contract claim, in effect, in a specialized court called the Court of Federal Claims. That case is still pending. There's going to be a hearing before the judge in that case on March 12th. But in the meantime, the states of New York and New Jersey filed their own lawsuit in federal court in Manhattan. And that's the lawsuit that ended up moving a lot faster. the district court judge there granted what's called a preliminary injunction, which basically said that the federal government had to stop this pause of funding uh, during the pendency of the case. And so that's where we are at this moment. There's been one additional wrinkle here, which I will just add right now for everybody else, which is that this case is now the decision to preliminarily enjoin this pause is now pending before the Second Circuit. And the Second Circuit is going to have to decide whether the district court got that ruling right. And in the meantime, they also have to decide what's going to happen during the pendency of that proceeding while that case is still going on. And in fact, if any of you are court watchers, tomorrow at 10 a.m., the Second Circuit's going to hear argument on this very narrow question of whether that funding should continue to remain flowing during the pendency of this appeal. And so that's the sort of basic backdrop. I'm happy to sort of dig into any piece of that if that is helpful. But back to you, Tom.
Can I just ask one follow-on to that?
Yeah.
So the U.S. Department of Transportation and Department of Justice lawyers are continuing to fight in court cases, arguing that they have the right to withhold this funding?
They are arguing a variety of things. One of those is that in both cases now, they are arguing that the court actually shouldn't take up the issue at all. In one case, it says that the court lacks jurisdiction over the case to begin with. In the other case, now they're saying, well, we paid out the money, so now this case is moot, meaning don't take up this case at all. And so the arguments have sort of ranged to both on the substance of things and then on these sort of core questions of whether the court can even take up the issue. But they're still being litigated actively in both courts.
Okay, great. Before we turn to Q&A, and again, if folks have questions, you can put them in the chat function and we'll try to address them. Kate, could I ask you just to talk briefly about kind of the advocacy efforts, what's been happening specifically in the last few weeks as this has been playing out, and kind of how is advocacy, which we do, connecting to this legal fight. And I think I mentioned earlier, Kate is the Executive Vice President at Regional Plan Association. We're thrilled to have her here. Kate, take it away.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, RPA manages the Build Gateway Now Coalition, which has over 52 members from business, labor, environmental groups, transit groups. And it's really just been pushing for several years to advance the Gateway program and really given it some momentum. And in addition to the research, the large body of research that you saw my colleague Megan posted in the chat that RPA has put out there over the years, we've been working with this coalition to really explain to the public why this whole program is necessary, explain the economic benefits of it, explain the environmental benefits of it. And I think one key thing that we've been talking a lot about is that this the tunnel project really benefits everyone. You don't have to actually be a commuter coming through the tunnel every day to reap the benefits of this investment. Because if you're driving anywhere in New Jersey or anywhere in Manhattan or anywhere else, and you're not even on the trains, you will see increased congestion if this project is not built. You really benefit from everyone else being on the transit system. And beyond that, there's all of the construction jobs, there's the long-term economic benefit. And so we've been talking a lot about those numbers and really trying to just get that out there and get that more socialized with the public and our key members in Congress. Over the past several weeks, we've been very active with this coalition. We did a lot of media when the Gateway Development Commission announced the potential pause in late January. We were out there at testifying at the hearing, and many of our partners in labor did some wonderful videos kind of explaining the real repercussions of this on their workers, on people who were on the job. There's 1,000 people who are actually working on the job who temporarily lost their jobs during the pause. We sent a letter to the White House with business and labor representatives talking about the economic benefits of this program and urging the president and the US DOT to continue to advance it. And we've really just sort of been out there in the media talking to everyone that we can through social media, in particular over the last week or so, explaining what's going on and talking about the sense of urgency to keep this going. And what we found is that there's actually national repercussions for this decision. No one working on any project, regardless of what state you live in, wants to see their project stop and have that be a surprise, right? You want consistency from the federal government. If the project's been approved, you want it to continue to advance. You want people who are working on the job and doing, their construction work to continue to be able to do that. Um, Anytime there's a delay, it drives up costs. So we've been talking to some of our national partners about the sort of ramifications of delays like this on projects across the country. So I think in terms of people on the call, if you want to do something or get more engaged, please reach out to us. My colleague Josh Berman, he can put his email in the chat. He manages the Gateway or manages the Build Gateway Now coalition and will engage you in any way you want and talk to you about how we can, talk to your community about how to advance the program and how you can get involved. So definitely reach out to him. Also reach out to your members of Congress. They've been really crucial in advancing this, and they will continue to play a key role over the next several weeks. Something like this could happen again. We don't really know what the future will hold. So the more we're organized and the more our members of Congress know that we really all care deeply about this project, the better. And third, thank Governor Sherrill and Governor Hochul, because they've been wonderful champions for this, and we want them to keep doing that. We want them to keep standing up for the project. They understand how important it is for our region to get this project built. And they've just been really excellent over the past several weeks. So they deserve a thank you. And I think that's it.
Thanks, Kate. I appreciate all that. And I'll just kind of add to it. Like we haven't seen any official estimates of how much. I mean, while officially work stopped on February 6th, in fact, the GDC had their contractors starting to slow down and decommission the work essentially in the days leading up to it, and then it took some time for them to get going in. We haven't seen a kind of official estimate of what that cost in terms of, just by the delay and additional work that was done to first break down and then reestablish the work site. But it does cost an enormous amount. We did a kind of back of the envelope analysis at RPA, just from a kind of accounting point of view. What is the value? $16 billion. What is the time value of the money in terms of interest payments and increased payments down the road? And what we were able to kind of estimate was that a 6-month delay would add something like 720 million to 1.34 billion dollars to the cost of Gateway at the end of the entire project. Just when you looked at kind of pushing out the expenses, inflation, interest rates, and other things like that. So these costs are enormous. Subash, one of the questions we got, not a big surprise, was kind of what's happening. I think last week, I'm sure many people saw Jano Lieber, the CEO of the MTA, at their board meeting talked about how the MTA is still waiting to receive federal funding for phase 2 of 2nd Avenue Subway. Could you explain whether there are kind of key differences or similarities with the MTA's potential lawsuit? And has the MTA even filed a lawsuit? I'm sorry, I'm not even sure if they have.
I don't believe that they have as of the last time I checked a little while ago. So I think they have not yet. There were those public comments that were made. I think, each of these lawsuits is its own sort of thing. And when it is filed, you can sort of evaluate the complaint and sort of assess the legal strategy. But I think until sort of MTA outwardly takes some action, I think that is sort of very much still it remains to be seen. That said, I think that the fact that the district court sort of moved quickly on the Gateway matter is clearly helpful precedent to MTA as it sort of thinks about how it is moving forward. And clearly as that gateway lawsuit proceeds, it will help to establish the body of law around this set of questions of how US DOT uses its authorities against its the entities with whom it has a grant agreement. So
Yeah.
I think that probably is about the extent to which we can sort of tackle that on a big call like this. But I think it's
Yeah, yeah. Well, can I ask to follow up? A couple folks have kind of asked a question about enforcement of this. What levers does the court have? And obviously, this is not the only arena where the federal government, the Trump administration, is finding itself in court with states or other entities challenging actions that they're taking. And in some of those cases, there's a sense that court rulings may not have been ignored or delayed upon their action. So some folks have asked kind of how do the courts ensure that decisions get enforced? How does that play out?
um, I would say that so far, with respect to this administration, on these grant related cases, and there have been a number of them either that have challenged grant conditions or rescissions of funding. I think when there are adverse decisions, the government has been complying with them.
Mhm.
It has removed some grant conditions when they were sort of challenged and struck down on a sort of nationwide basis. When funding is sort of ordered to flow, including here, they have complied with that. I think that it's to be expected for them to sort of seek appeal as they are doing in the Gateway case, and that is a perfectly sort of normal process that they are undertaking. But the folks in the states of New York and New Jersey, when they had concerns about whether GDC was getting its money, they went to court immediately. The court called the parties in and they worked through those issues, and the money did start to flow. And I think there are some realities about sort of the the money spigot not automatically being able to be turned on. It isn't like withdrawing $100 from an ATM and handing it over. So there is some process, but within a couple of days, I think all the money was released here. And so I would say
Yeah.
that that would be my sort of assessment based on how they've handled these grant related cases.
Yeah, that they've been following the court orders but appealing at the same time. So the court cases are not yet done. Could you talk a little bit? Some folks have asked kind of what is the justification that the federal government is using to pause the funding?
Um, the stated reason for the original pause in funding was tied to the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program. And historically, that's been a program that has required grant recipients of the Department of Transportation to have a program that is designed to provide greater opportunities to what are termed disadvantaged business enterprises. And one part of that program, the presumption of disadvantage being tied to race or gender, has come under judicial scrutiny over the past few years. And in early October of last year, October 2025, the Department of Transportation removed that presumption of disadvantage. And that has created a whole cascading series of regulatory changes that we don't need to talk about here. But that change was the purported basis that the Department of Transportation used to say, hey, we're going to conduct a civil rights review of your compliance with DBE regulations, and in particular, sort of a focus on this presumption of disadvantage. And my understanding is that there was sort of a lengthy back and forth that you can see in the court papers, that GDC and the federal government have filed, and I think that if you read the sort of complaint that was filed by GDC as well as some of the follow-on briefing, they highlight the ways in which this is a little unusual to sort of cut off funding and then start an investigation, or to start a sort of more in-depth look at things. So it is an unconventional strategy to cut off funding first and then start to look into the problem, look into the issue. But that was sort of the impetus for
Yeah.
this
Well, and,
pause.
and
This
maybe
needed
that
it.
unconventional strategy is what led to that preliminary injunction that you talked about.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. We've gotten some questions about the connection between this all and Penn Station, which I think folks know on this call probably all know, is going through. Amtrak is leading a procurement process right now with three announced finalists, I believe, for a, public-private partnership kind of assessment, to pick a team to advance a plan for transforming Penn Station, which in our minds, which we've been supportive of transforming Penn Station and fixing it, both because it needs upgrades just for what it's supposed to do, and because someday it's going to need to handle the additional capacity that Gateway is going to bring. Kate, would you be happy to take a shot at kind of talking about that status and maybe how those things are connected?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, look, I think first you have to get the new tunnel built. That's the first priority. We've been talking about that project for a few decades now. And, you may all remember that we had a project called the Art Tunnel that was started 15 years ago and then stopped. So, this is long overdue, the new tunnel under the Hudson River. It's kind of ridiculous we don't have it already. So that is first and foremost. We absolutely need that tunnel for additional capacity coming in to Manhattan. Of course, we also want Penn Station to be, a big, wonderful station that feels nicer and feels safer and can accommodate more riders. But fundamentally, if you don't have the capacity across the Hudson River, there's a question as to, how much you want to invest around there because you don't have the riders coming in that you thought you were going to. So while I think we support obviously making improvements to Penn Station, building the new tunnel under the Hudson River is really the first priority that we want to continue moving along.
Yeah. And I would add, I think,
Summary, Tom?
yeah, I think that's a good one. And I'd say that, like, support, the two are connected. And it kind of makes no sense to be spending a lot of money on fixing Penn Station if you're not also fixing the infrastructure that serves it. Okay, so let me uh, kind of as a final question, maybe each of you, and Subash from a legal perspective, and then Kate from the work that we do, what should we leave folks with in terms of what else can advocates be doing to support Gateway in this moment? And maybe Subash, from a legal perspective, is there anything people should be following or paying attention to or weighing in on? And then Kate, I'll give you the final word.
I think that much like the uncertainty with respect to timing or funding, the legal uncertainty, whether that is sort of hearings after hearings on these topics, I think people should be keeping a close eye on the ways that those translate into impacts on the ability to deliver the project. And so I think that is one thing I would highlight. The second thing is that there is a good amount of information out there, and some of it is good information, and some of it is more questionable information. And so, as you are digesting this all, and you're reading things or hearing things, I do think that it's worth sort of making sure that the flow of information here. For example, take the idea of this administration has complied with these orders in this instance. And I think that's an important thing here because GDC and the states went to court and they were able to obtain the relief they were seeking. And so I think we should just sort of keep those things in perspective as we're moving forward. Turn it to
Yeah,
Reed.
and
Yeah.
if I can add on to that, my sense is that these legal arguments may drag out for months or longer. That this is not about this has not been concluded by a long shot.
The cases themselves are dragging out, and then yeah, this issue I think is still a very much important one for everyone to stay on top of and engaged.
Yeah. Kate, last word?
Yeah, I mean, I just second like educating yourself. I can't count the number of people who've at one moment or another over the past year said, "Oh, I hear Gateway's dead. Oh, I hear Gateway's back on. Oh, I hear congestion pricing isn't functioning anymore." And it's you have to go a little bit beyond the headlines these days to actually understand what's going on, because not only is it very kind of complicated in a lot of situations, but also the news is not always accurate. So that's number one. Number two, get involved with our Build Gateway Now coalition. If you have like a local sort of group of riders, that's particularly helpful for us to share stories and to have some videos and real narratives of how bad it is traveling across the Hudson River and how we really need improvements. So we're really looking for those personal stories and personal narratives. And then I would just say, sort of reach out to your elected officials and explain, how much you care about these kinds of large infrastructure investments, not only for the near-term benefits they bring in terms of jobs, but for the next generation and, the future of our region. So please get involved. There's a lot going on right now. It's a busy time. And if there's any way we can help kind of cut through the noise and all of that news and help you advocate and help you talk to people about this, please let us know and we'll do all that we can.
That's a great way. I have to add on to that, Kate. Last week, we had an event to celebrate, among others, the mayors of the Raritan Valley Line Coalition, who have been such effective advocates. And so I got to give a shout out to those mayors in the communities which do not have a one-seat ride into Manhattan today and have been really extraordinary, bipartisan, effective advocates for this. And that's exactly the kind of advocacy and work that we continue to need. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've had a terrific turnout. Over 150 people for an event that was organized less than a week ago. I think that shows the interest on this. Please continue to reach out to us if you have questions and other things. And thank you again to Subash and Kate for spending time with us this afternoon. You were both terrific. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Nice to see everyone.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.